Hello, audience. Let me start with a brief introduction of myself first. My name is Michiel Haasbroek and I work as the Chief Finance and Risk Officer for Banque Internationale Luxembourg in Switzerland. I'm based in Zurich. I've actually always worked in banking, and my work brought me to a number of different countries, mainly in Asia, but I've also worked extensively throughout Europe, Australia. I started in risk management, of which a substantial number of years was spent in the country risk department of a large globally active bank. After that, I obtained a PhD in international political economy, and in 2020 I decided to move back to Europe and joined my current employer. Like many of you, I've had first-hand experience with a number of crises, from the Eurozone debt crisis to the trade war, the pandemic, and now of course the impact of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But there were also events that did have an impact, but where the shockwaves remained much more contained. Think of the ongoing threat on the Korean Peninsula, a rising China that actively alters the economic and political map of the world. In essence, geopolitical risk has perhaps been far more present than we always thought. Right now, however, it appears that this talk is actually a couple of years too late. While I wanted to talk about geopolitical risk, it is fair to say that at the moment we have passed the risk stage and we're now firmly into the stage where the risk is actually manifesting itself. We can still contribute, of course, by giving some background analysis. The question, where does the current situation actually come from, remains relevant. And can we, from the analysis of its origin, say a little bit more about the depth and duration of the situation? I believe we can. So in terms of content, what I would like to address today is a comprehensive overview of the current state of geopolitical risk. This would not only need to cover what is going on, but also what we can do to measure, understand, and manage the risk. There's hardly any doubt at the moment that geopolitical risk is top of mind of decision makers, and rightfully so. We expect that volatility in global affairs is likely to continue. The IMF has recently revised its World Economic Outlook and revised down its expectation for global growth in the context of the various shocks that we've experienced, and the effect of the changing geopolitical environment manifests itself in areas such as cybersecurity, supply chain stability, and operational level concerns such as staff health and safety, and the pressure to ensure sanction compliance. That forces us to grapple with the question, what is actually going on here? Can we find common themes along the various manifestations of risk we see? I like to propose that we are dealing with two distinct push and pull factors, or macro trends, that affect the behaviors of citizens and countries alike. These two factors help to describe and capture trends and can best be described as fragmentation and distribution. These two aspects capture a wide-ranging scala of different trends we see at the moment that function as drivers of the behavior of politicians, professionals, and regular citizens like you and me. First, let us look at fragmentation. In this column, I argue that we see here such things as fragmentation of technological standards. Think, for instance, about the race towards 5G and the political implications this brings with it. It is in fact a little similar to the race in standards for video cassettes, with the important difference that the impact of 5G is far more pervasive in our lives than the impact of the VCR ever was. 5G should bring us applications that are very, very far ranging, and of course that's a little bit more invasive than the video cassette ever was in our lives. It shows, however, that there are new challengers on the horizon that cannot be easily plied to follow what is dictated by the incumbent that used to articulate technological standards. We also see a fragmentation of resource ownership. This is not just in the area of energy commodities, but also in input factors such as rare earth. The creation of photovoltaics, which we all rely on for the energy transition, is for instance highly dependent on these rare earth, as is manufacturing of semiconductors or other technological developments. This highlights a global competition for economic input factors that will help to determine what the dominant economic superpower will be in various sectors. And this again points to rising competition among countries of the world. Fragmentation is a process that follows concentration. In this sense, the period of globalization is likely to be firmly behind us for now, as countries and companies are actively looking to reduce their reliance on single production markets. The experience of the pandemic and the trade war both contributed to a sudden realization that we cannot fully depend on single jurisdictions any longer. For instance, companies that had a strong manufacturing base in China are now floating the idea of a China plus one strategy, whereby there would need to be a swing location to address the risk of dependency on a single location. Indeed, the IMF advocated that global supply chains need more, not less supply diversity to lessen the impact of future shocks. Finally, we see a fragmentation of policy responses. The best example perhaps here is probably how different countries handled the COVID situation. There were different divergences between developed and emerging markets, with the former having much better access to vaccines, but also within the developed world and between emerging countries. These have in turn fostered different economic outcomes. Think for instance of China's economy, initially easily bouncing back from the early restrictions, only to find itself struggling economically, while other countries are regarding the pandemic only in their rear-view mirror. Fragmentation then points to the rise of challengers of the global order that had turned briefly into a unipolar moment. These years we are witnessing a test whether the existing order can cater for the inclusion of rising and disenfranchised powers, or whether something altogether new will emerge. At the same time, we have issues with distribution. Globalization made the distribution of negative externalities much easier. As global barriers to economic integrations were scaled back in the host of the deregulation, the transmission of financial shock did not stay confined to single markets any longer. This especially hit emerging markets disproportionately, as they tend to have weaker institutions that help to shield them from these events. The same holds true for negative externalities from environmental degradation. While this has a stronger origin in more developed economies, as these consume far more energy, the effects in terms of climate change are often felt much more pronounced in more vulnerable countries. This intra-country and international distribution of wealth and income pose another significant policy dilemma. It creates political resentment, it makes societies harder to govern, and it points to the limits of some of the prevalent thinking about economics. Taken together, these factors combined make that there are strong bottom-up forces demanding and working towards a change of the globalized world as we know it. Spurred further by an increasing competition on economic and political primacy, new actors engage in the arena of political debate and contest the position of the advocacy of universal values. The field at the moment is wide open, and the question is what mechanisms the world still has in place to exacerbate or contain the situation of re-emerging great power competition. The world had a comparatively good ride after the Second World War. Great power conflict was averted, even though proxy conflict meant that it was not an altogether peaceful period. But perhaps one of the most significant traits of the post-war period was that we found and created institutions that would help to address shared problems and provide a platform to adjudicate conflict. Together, the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, did their best to at least provide an arena where the countries of the world could get together and address their difference in a diplomatic way. These seem to be like good arrangements, but that appraisal also depended very much on your perspective. Especially in the 2000s, emerging economies expressed a growing discontent with the lack of representativeness of these institutions. The Security Council, the G7 and the distribution of voting rights in the IMF and the World Bank did in no way reflect that the world had changed since these institutions were brought to life. No wonder then that the output of these institutions was questioned as being self-serving for the nations that actually controlled them. And under the banner of universal values, as it was seen by emerging markets, these institutions did not do more than promulgating policies in the interest of the incumbent under only a thin veil of universality. The dismay of the emerging world, coupled perhaps with a cynical approach to self-interest mainly by the US, led to a hollowing out of global governance, right at the moment that transnational problems would come to dominate the policy agenda. In the past couple of years, we've seen the rise of transnational issues on the policy agenda. The pandemic, of course, was a prime example, but we can also think of the repercussions of climate change, transnational crime, financial vulnerabilities, and interlinkages and terrorism. All these issues call for a concerted response by the global community of states. However, diverging interests between states, the earlier mentioned decline in the global governance, and the pursuit of national political agendas have all contributed to a complication in the formulation of global policy responses. This then creates a fragile state of the world, an increase in transnational issues without a credible approach to global governance make it increasingly difficult to effectively counter problems that affect and threaten us all. This in turn means that geopolitical risk will only increase in relevance and globalization is in reversal. In this context, it's often easy to point to newly emerging risks, but it's much harder to actually assess the impact and duration of these events. In this state of the world, what are internationally active enterprises exposed to? I try to break it down in three distinct blocks. Firstly, economic exposure and exposure to the political environment. Secondly, exposure to specific markets. And thirdly, the problem of supply chains. Exposure comes in different orders. It is not always direct exposure that determines whether a company is affected by a specific event. Any consumer in Europe that wants to put up the heating will understand this. While they are not directly involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, they do feel the second-order effect through higher energy prices. These higher energy prices also carry a third-order effect in that they contribute to rising inflation and thereby to weakened economic prospects. Economic impact is of course one of the most prominent areas of measurable impact of geopolitical events. Conflict, especially when it involves exporters of natural resources, has the potential to create significant ripple effects that extend far beyond the borders of the countries involved in the conflict itself. The chain of events should also encompass what the effects of an economic downturn driven by resource scarcity are. Here we see an important diverging trend between emerging and developed economies. Already widened because of the response to COVID, the need for a fiscal response to these problems drives the wedge between emerging markets and developed economies only even further. In assessing the exposure to geopolitically driven economic downturns, smart risk managers can create value for their organizations by analyzing how far these ripple effects may actually reach. It is often said in this context that when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And especially emerging markets have become more acutely aware of this situation. I have found, however, that it is much more difficult for established corporations from developed markets to understand the nature of second and third order effects. For instance, when I was working in China and I had to report to my head office on the economic situation in the country, even just 5 years ago, there was an understanding that an economic crisis in China would remain confined to the country or the immediate region. That, as we should all take to heart, is a very outdated view. Overall, the world has become a much more complex and much less predictable place. How to navigate this increased complexity is addressed in the following slides. The traditional emerging markets now also vie for a place in the sun, though they remain a greater source of risk given their emerging nature, of course. Although most people feel they know an emerging market when they see one, the phrase is actually hard to define. One widely quoted description says that an emerging market is one where politics matters at least as much as economics. This is because political institutions in emerging markets tend to be weak and power is often captured by an unrepresentative elite. In such conditions, the process by which laws and regulations are drafted and applied is easily subverted, which means that investors can face a changeable and unpredictable operating environment. For these reasons, political risk management is of particular importance for companies that operate in emerging markets. But it goes beyond that. Increasingly, companies entering emerging markets not just to have access to low-cost labor or in order to be closer to the other nodes in the supply chain, but also because they want to actually have access to the consumers that this market is home to. And this comes with a whole new risk of exposure. Firstly, brands and companies are often seen as representing their home market. For instance, when tensions between China and Japan flared up over a group of islands that is claimed by both, Chinese citizens responded by attacking Japanese cars in China. These cars were the objects that were most easy at hand for citizens that wanted to vent their frustration about the actions of Japan without actually having to go there. Also in China, companies have had to come to terms with the fact that it is a country that is perhaps more sensitive to perceived incursions on its national pride. A number of advertising campaigns from Western companies clearly got the consumer wrong and had to backtrack and even publicly apologize. This shows that misunderstanding the market can come at a cost. These are just examples of a need to do more in terms of market access analysis than a mere look at the number of consumers or the spending power of these consumers. These consumers have different preferences, different attitudes and different sensitivities than your home market consumer, and this carries the risk for companies that get it wrong. Underestimating the local resentment is another factor. While companies can reach agreements with local authorities on the presence of a highly polluting plant, waste disposal factory, shipbreaking installation or an oil refinery, the blessing of local authorities does not always mean that the local population is also on board. As a foreign company, it is easy to make rash decisions when entering a new market by assuming that market will just be like home. It will not, and companies are well advised to carefully study social risks, cultural preferences and changing attitudes, especially when targeting the local consumer. Geopolitical risks can easily be exacerbated by unconscious bias by those that are exposed to it. One of the most fundamental issues we have to grapple with is the failure of the convergence thesis. In general, this thesis holds that a large swath of economic theory has told us that when emerging markets get richer, they will create a middle class, and that middle class will want to have the same degree of political freedom that exists in the liberal democracies of the West. In doing so, economic development would thus trigger a process that would almost naturally lead to a convergence towards the liberal democracy. This has driven decades of politics aimed at economic integration. So if we wonder why the countries in the West created economic ties with Russia, it may be well because they actually believed that creating trade integration would lead to economic or to political convergence. The same was maybe underlying the accession of China to the World Trade Organization in 2001. There, that idea of fostering greater trade links would lead again to greater political convergence, and countries would become more like the Western economies that we know. However, we see that democracies of the West have cast a decreasingly attractive shadow over the world. Large emerging markets of the world became more confident on the back of years of improving economic fortunes, and this change is an important bottom-up driver of the changing global order. Now, what to do about it is then the question. As globalization and internationally operating companies will not disappear overnight, it is important to work on the toolkit to manage the risk of the changing global order and the geopolitical risk that it brings. Here I want to make three distinct recommendations: understand, prepare and act, and be a good citizen. Let's start with the need to understand the risks you are actually exposed to. Firstly, this requires that geopolitical risk analysis is firmly embedded into the decision-making process of companies. It is easy to fall into the trap of the confirmation bias, but how could we avoid such myopia? Here we can draw on an existing toolkit that has proven its value time and again. It starts with scenario analysis that rests on the notion of multiple possible outcomes. Often it is hard to foresee how a certain situation may develop. Wargaming, or a dialogue where different parties involved in the analysis will need to defend conflicting or even opposing views, can help to sharpen the various scenarios and avoid that we only factor in the analysis that is readily available. Creative thinking and a strong backbone are the attributes of the successful risk manager in this regard. The element of creative thinking will also ensure that attention is given to second and third order effects. This takes time and should be done with care. A credible challenge, maybe even supported by external providers that have experience in different markets, can make the difference between an analysis that supports the objective and an analysis that is mere window dressing for decision makers. Scenario analysis and credible challenge will also help you to map out the nature of your exposure, even when it concerns second and third order effects. But now the question comes, what you can do about that exposure. Here, the recommended response is not much different than for other risk classes. Hedge, understand, plan, and develop contingencies. After the trade war and the pandemic, the first point is an open door. Do not become dependent on a single market or a single supplier, as this will create immediate knock-on effects in case of a disruption. This will, however, take time to organize and, importantly, scale benefits may have to be sacrificed for security and stability. The second point is easily neglected, but is of an increasing importance. Understand the market you are actually operating in. Take the time to exchange with the local population. Ensure representation in your management team. Diversity is an important factor here. And allow a transparent dialogue with your staff. It may well be that local staff has a very different view on how a certain situation may play out in the future. They tend to have a better understanding of the preferences and sentiment prevalent among the local population and staff. Varying attitudes to problems can easily be overlooked by companies that operate in foreign markets. Ensure therefore that your company encompasses the views of local staff in the decision-making process. But this is only relevant if there's also a clear line of communication that helps the decision makers in head office to understand what is going on. This can be done by means of a newsletter, regular exchanges, travel by decision maker to the company's locations, and vice versa, or other means. But we should assume that local developments are always we should not assume that local developments are always well understood in that faraway head office. Planning for contingencies is always valuable. But don't underestimate its relevance also in view of geopolitical risk. We may have all been humbled by how the pandemic really played out, or did anyone ever run a scenario with 2-year running lockdowns when we were doing our BCP analysis. But even if you get the manifestation of the risk wrong, it creates an alert staff and enhances readiness. This should be done both on a strategic level and on a local level when you're operating in a country that is not the home market. On a strategic level, decision makers should factor in the fallout of production side or consumer markets, while on the local level, contingency planning is probably best kept more operational. Think about evacuation plans, communication and interaction with the press, and readiness for local staff, for instance in managing critical documents, servers or hard drives. This goes beyond regular BCP. Finally, there's a recommendation for all companies who especially manage the risk of negative retribution in local markets. Just be a good corporate citizen and elaborate on corporate social responsibility. The E, S and G all have something for companies that operate in more challenging markets abroad. Increasingly, companies have come to understand that production locations abroad are not a low-rule alternative to domestic production. Public advocacy groups have long since put production abroad in their crosshairs, and companies can no longer get away with a different treatment of their staff, even when subcontracted compared to the home market. More and more, companies exclude certain markets that cannot guarantee adequate protection of workers to minimize this risk. The same holds for negative environmental impact. This faces international scrutiny and risks retribution from the local population. If you happen to run a refinery in Nigeria, do apply the same environmental standards and ensure that these are upheld as in your home market, to avoid the risk of violent repercussions, degradation of the living environment of the original inhabitants, and being put to blame in domestic media. Advocacy groups increasingly link a company's behavior in its host market to the image it wants to portray in its home market. Finally, good governance helps to withstand the negative impact of public scrutiny. It also contributes to being seen as a responsible party in your production or consumption markets abroad. Treating local staff the same as the expatriate staff and aiming for positive impact to the local community are increasingly under scrutiny and even being demanded by local staff. In sum, we have seen that geopolitical risk is no longer just a risk. It is increasingly manifesting itself across a range of different dimensions. These dimensions are not just direct or economic, but add to an increasingly complex operating environment for internationally active corporations. A changing global order, with new entrants that vie for a place in the top, have forced a reassessment of theoretical assumptions around political and economic convergence. This takes place against a background of less international cooperation, even in the face of a growing number of transnational challenges. Companies can plan and improve how they navigate this complex environment by using tried and tested risk management approaches. Scenario analysis, preparation, contingency planning all contribute to improved preparedness. But let's not forget, understanding the nature and depth and duration of your exposure is a starting point of good risk management. With that, I come to the end of my little presentation. It was a great pleasure to contribute to the Risk Awareness Week, and I hope that this talk has helped to sharpen your views. Do not hesitate to contact me in case of any questions that you may have. I'm always happy to answer any emails or anything further. Thanks for your attendance and have a good day.